the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is April the 8th, the 98th day of the year. Only 267 days remain to the year's over with. You know, and also on this day, the practitioners of Buddhism in Japan celebrate the birth of Buddha. He lived in India sometime between the 6th and 4th centuries BC and founded Buddhism. It's also the anniversary of President Harry Truman calling to seize all domestic steel mills to prevent the 1952 steel strike from happening. There was also a test flight of Gemini 1 took place on this date. And finally, April 8, 1974, Hank Aaron of the Atlanta Braves hit his 715th career home run in a game against the Los Angeles Dodgers. Broke Babe Ruth's home run record that had stood since 1935. Well, it's also a few other little gems. It's National Zoo Lovers Day, International Romani Day, Baby Massage Day, National Empanada Day, International Pageant Day, National Dogfighting Awareness Day, National Library Workers Day, Draw a Picture of a Bird Day, National Pygmy Hippo Day, Identity Management Day. Now, this is one that International Be Kind to Lawyers Day. My father always said lawyers should be seen and not had. National Alzheimer's Day. And now we're going to see what we got in the news. Now, let's see. Anti-Trump protesters were asked why they were so mad. And they started to describe the fantasy land they wanted to live in. Things that would have destroyed this country in a Mississippi minute. Well, 10 North Korean soldiers crossed the line in a demilitarized zone. In fact, warning shots were fired. Trump administration's fired a female Navy admiral at NATO. Senior NATO official Vice Admiral Chatfield fired as the Trump administration purges wokeness and DEI from the Pentagon. She was the only woman on NATO's military committee, dismissed from the alliance over the weekend without explanation. One of only a handful of female Navy 3-star officers, first woman to lead the Naval War College. She held that job till 2023. Well, the Supreme Court has told President Trump he may, in fact, use the 1798 law to deport criminals and illegal immigrants. And before anybody starts ranting and raving, by definition, if you're here illegally, that is a crime. Turns out the Harris team kept a secret list of Republican judges because they were sure Biden was going to die. And she didn't need to be sworn in. Well, President Trump has been doing a lot of fundraising for Republicans, getting ready for the 2026 midterm elections. The South Miami is asking for legal guidance from Fort Myers officials. No, I take that back. Fort Myers officials came under fire for blocking a city agreement with ICE. I don't know why everybody seems to believe every criminal in the world should come here. Now, they don't want to take any of them into their homes. They want you to do it. Now, Let's see, we got Trump. President Trump's back on track after the judge who tried to stop him from kicking out violent thugs has been silenced by the Supreme Court. Let's see. Monica Lewinsky has joined the Hollywood inner circle. She's now suddenly acceptable. Doge has cut $51 million from U.S. African Development Foundation, including $229,000 dedicated to helping market shea butter. Money went toward mango drying facilities and marketing for pineapple juice and shea butter. Who are the lunatics that came up with all these things that we pour money into? It's not their money that gets poured into it. It's our money. Well, the young man, the football player that got stabbed for asking somebody to please move, the one that stabbed him, you have to understand what a bad life he had up to that point. Former Clinton advisor calls out the rudderless Democratic Party for being out of touch with America. Congressional Democrats have a 66% disapproval rating. I'm surprised it's not higher. Doug Schoen, a former advisor to President Clinton, said many Democratic parties missing the mark when it comes to their leadership, direction, and strategy. They're just totally out of step with the American people. And the American people are tired of being everybody's doormat. Living down here near the border, we see some of the craziest things going on that you'd ever want to see. And elected officials are supporting it. As a disabled veteran, I asked our local congresswoman for assistance. She didn't have time for the little problems of disabled veterans. She had to spend her time taking care of the migrants. And then a senior member of her office staff assured me that they were not going to accept any congressional complaints from veterans. That just wasted their time that would be better spent taking care of the migrants. Using taxpayer dollars, I might add. And all this ranting and raving about giving them homes and giving them this and giving them that. Do you think she's taken one of them into her home? Of course not. She's one of the ruling elite, don't you know? And she was a friend for 20 years. Until she got the big head. Well, let's see. Is there anything else? President Trump has planted a new Jackson magnolia tree at the White House after the first one had to be chopped down. Well, this judge who is so totally opposed to President Trump deporting criminals can still hold the president in contempt. Doesn't make any difference to him what the Supreme Court says because he's one of God's anointed. Well, critics are saying the United Nations has to reform its anti-Israel media department. They're using money given from various countries to run a campaign against Israel, which I find ludicrous. All right. See if there's anything else worth talking about. A Former Tigers executive Sam Menzen's resignation centers around lewd photos sent to female employees. You know, to that I would say, get a life. Okay, that's what we got. Well, Bill Mayer doubts Cuomo can overcome the nursing home scandal. He's going to run for, that scandal happened while he was governor of the state of New York. He's going to run for mayor now of New York City. And frankly, they need somebody in charge. I'm just not sure he's the right one. Alrighty. Well, you know, if you notice, I have cut down drastically on the, what happened on this date and all that. What you all originally asked me to do, and then when you got what you wanted, you don't want it. So, as I said yesterday when we were talking about the Clark Air Base Hospital in the Philippines, today we're going to talk about the Spencer State Hospital in West Virginia. It's known as West Virginia's second hospital for the insane. Accepted its first patient July 18th, 1893. Stayed open for the better part of a century. During that time, the hospital cared for arguably the most vulnerable and unfortunate members of society. I'm referring to the mentally ill and the developmentally disabled. You know, West Virginia state officials recognized the need for a second mental hospital in 1885 when the patient population in the primary facility reached an overflow of critical proportions. Patients were packed together like sardines in some areas. Something obviously needed to be done to alleviate the confined conditions. The site deemed suitable for a new facility was erected in Rowan County, 1887. The monolithic quarter-mile brick structure was soon under construction. The Rowan County reporter and journalist Catherine Keene wrote a series of articles to mark the close of the Spencer State Hospital in 1989. One article, she said, as one explores the hospital's past, the story unfolds of a hard-working, low-paid staff who care for their patients as if they're members of their own families, even though they lack the training and the numbers to offer whatever actual therapy was mandated by each new arrival and each new trend in medical health over the years. Story emerges of a quest for humane treatment for victims of mental illness and retardation and those who fought to make this ideal a reality in West Virginia. Keene went on to cite the multitude of reasons for which the patients were admitted and sometimes committed to Spencer State Hospital. It was documented in the 1910 State Board of Control report. Included alcohol access, senility, hereditary insanity, worry, ill health, overworked, head and other injuries, syphilis, epilepsy, paralysis, morphia, cocaine use, chorea, disease of the uterus, pneumonia, bereavement, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, peripheral disorders, what's called childbed fever. But not all of those folks that resided at Spencer State were actually medically and mentally ill. As the facility expanded, it became something of a makeshift orphanage and geriatric nursing home. Took in children whose parents could no longer afford to raise them, and the elderly and infirm who needed specialist care their families were incapable of providing. Due to the popularity of such TV shows as American Horror Story, Asylum, and movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, most people tend to shudder at the thought of what conditions inside a 20th century American mental institution must have been like. And yet, the conditions inside the walls of Spencer State Hospital were more humane than you might think, at least at first. Images of the patients being locked into tiny cramped cells and strapped tightly into the confines of straitjackets are the staple of 1,000 horror movies. But the reality is the patients were rarely locked in their rooms at all. In fact, in the beginning, many of the patient rooms didn't have any doors. And during the first few decades of its existence, the hospital staff were by and large a caring body of people who wanted to provide their patients with the best possible care. But then the trouble started. As the patient and resident population grew, the worsening economic situation was cited as an explanation for understaffing. Patient to care provider ratios of 8-to-1 or higher became the new norm as the staff became increasingly swamped by their crippling workload. The period immediately following the Second World War can hardly be described as the mental health profession's finest hour. Lobotomization, Burke attempt at brain surgery that would not have looked out of place being performed in a carpenter's shed or an abattoir, became the in vogue treatment for what was deemed to be severe mental illness. If you recall the story, Joseph Kennedy had his oldest daughter lobotomized because she was out of control. Actually spent her time with boys. You know, most mental health professionals at the time believed severe mental illness were caused by disease in the brain, mostly the frontal and prefrontal lobes. Surgery on these lobes, they reasoned, could alleviate the worst of the symptoms. Earliest form of lobotomy practice in the U.S. was a surgical procedure performed in an operating theater, which involved the neurosurgeon drilling a hole into the patient's skull in order to access the frontal lobes of the brain. There were two doctors who specialized in this field of neurology, Dr. James Watts and Dr. Walter Freeman. And they pioneered a technique for accessing the brain by drilling in through the outer skull. With the volume of reported cases of mental illness on the rise across the U.S., the shortcomings of this procedure became very clear. It had to be performed by skilled surgeons in a fully staffed operating theater. Well, Freeman, though, hit upon what he thought was a brilliant idea, the transorbital lobotomy. That soon earned the nickname the ice pick lobotomy. It was a brutal process of hammering a pointed metal rod into the patient's brain by way of an entry point just above the patient's eyeball. And the prongs of this tool were slid underneath the patient's upper eyelid, with the physician performing the procedure had flipped back. And then the tool, known as the orbitoclast, was hit repeatedly with a hammer till its tip penetrated the brain tissue, at which point the doctor would jiggle it around in order to complete what they call the operation. According to Freeman, the great benefit of this type of lobotomy was that it could be performed in asylums and mental institutions across the country without the need for an operating theater. And anesthesia, of course, was considered optional. The procedure was practiced extensively at Spencer State Hospital, sometimes by Freeman himself when he'd drop in unannounced. Well, during the 40s and 50s, thousands of lobotomies were being performed in American mental institutions every year. Little clinical justification for this procedure and certainly no proven benefits. Some patients died during the lobotomy itself, others shortly afterwards. Some took their own lives, and others simply wasted away or became violent due to the brain damage that occurred when the procedure was botched. What is certain is that the lobotomized individual was never the same afterwards, and the change is rarely for the better. Lobotomy ultimately declined in popularity when drugs were released that combated mental illness in a more effective way. Of course, according to Freeman, it wasn't as much fun as taking a hammer and ramming the thing up into somebody's brain. Not many hospitals can make the dubious claim of possessing a dungeon, but that was the nickname given to a makeshift morgue located down in the basement. In his 2014 book, Inside Haunted Spencer State Hospital, author George Duding recounts a number of disturbing rumors that center about this part of the building. He attributes the sound of clanking chains heard in that particular area to the rumor that physically violent patients were restrained down there in the past, secured with links of chain. It is an old truism that doctors bury their mistakes. Might explain the persistent story that doctors at Spencer State permitted the burial of the corpses of some deceased patients, especially those that have any family members to claim them, underneath the dungeon floor. Although Duding doesn't find this particular rumor himself, he does contend that To some, it is believable because many floors of the rooms in the underground dungeon consist of dirt in places, along with concrete in others. And those who frequented the underground areas beneath the structure have claimed that they can feel the ghosts of dead patients breathing on them. Well, Dudding recounts a 1970 interview that he conducted with a Spencer State Hospital maintenance worker. Man claimed to have experienced multiple encounters with something or someone paranormal inside those walls, particularly down in the lower levels. His work was interrupted by peculiar noises and, more disturbingly, by something touching him when there didn't appear to be anybody else in the room. Indeed, the man felt on more than one occasion he wasn't alone in what appeared to be a completely empty part of the hospital. And we've all experienced that particular sensation of being watched and know just how unnerving it can be when we think we're all alone. And on a sad note, not long after he spoke with George Dudding about his paranormal experience at Spencer State, the maintenance man took his own life. However, this was the only employee-related death associated with the hospital. Another worker there, who's referred to only as Mr. DB, told the Dudding of his being harassed by unseen presences during his time there. Could there have been a factor in why the man one day chose to murder his wife? Well, certainly there are those that believe that is certainly the case. According to Dudding, I sometimes think that some strange evil force within the walls of the old lunatic asylum had driven him to commit such a heinous crime. Could it be possible he should have been a patient rather than an employee at the Spencer State Hospital? Well, I've met a number of people working in the medical facilities that I think should have been patients themselves. You know, many of the former employees of the Spencer State Hospital have gone on record regarding their ghostly experiences at the facility. There have been reports of disembodied voices and auditory phenomena that occur again and again, including the wails and moans of those who sound as though they're in the clutches of pain, fear, and despair. And disembodied screaming has been heard echoing throughout the empty corridors. Sound generated to turn even, and guaranteed to turn even the bravest paranormal investigators' blood to ice water. You know, although paranormal activity has been reported throughout almost every area of that building, much of it seems to cluster in around the lower floors and the basement dungeon area. Eyewitness testimony regarding the basement bears a startling consistency. The feeling of being watched, or at least in the presence of some invisible entity. You know, Spencer State Hospital was demolished and replaced with a Walmart, along with a bevy of other smaller businesses, some of which still experience paranormal activity to this day. Clearly a legacy left over from the site's days hosting one of the world's most haunted hospitals. And although this facility itself is now gone, there's one sad remnant of those poor souls who lived their lives within its walls before ultimately meeting their end there, most without family to bury them. A short distance away from Route 36 on a hillside located close to the local elementary school is the unmarked graves of hundreds of former Spencer State Hospital residents. These unfortunates had nobody to mark their passing and nobody to pay for a private funeral. And some had simply outlived their own families, where others had been tragically abandoned and forgotten by families either unwilling or unable to care for them. The only way the passers-by might know the presence at all is a single sign. It says Spencer State Hospital Cemetery. And then below that it says Spencer State Hospital, first called the second hospital for the insane, opened July 18th, 1893. Patients with many disorders lived in that facility, as well as the elderly people and unwanted children. Many residents without families lived there most of their lives and are buried in unmarked graves. And according to the WPA information, in 1940, Cemetery Number 1 had 750 unmarked graves. 7 others marked. Cemetery Number 2 had 100 marked graves, none unmarked. Earliest stone dated 1902. Spencer State Hospital closed June 1989. And the cemetery, of course, is reputed to be haunted, which would come as no surprise when you consider its background. And apparitions have been seen to wander there by local residents. It's believed that these are spirits of Spencer State Hospital's abandoned and unremembered dead, still earthbound and attempting to draw attention to their plight. And certainly, those spirits, unwanted, cast aside, certainly have reason to be unhappy. Well, let's go to Victoria, Australia. The Aradale Mental Hospital, formerly known as the Ararat Lunatic Asylum. You know, we must speak kindly about those. We don't call them lunatics anymore. They're people with mental problems. You know, southeastern Australia, state of Victoria, has a somewhat well-known haunted hospital, named after a nearby hill upon which early settlers confirmed the name of Mount Ararat. The city of Ararat was built upon gold, more specifically the gold rush of the late 1850s. This turned it from a relatively small town into a thriving, booming center of commerce. Major gold seam was found and worked by Chinese gold miners. This goes a long way toward explaining the significant role the Chinese have played in the formation of Ararat's history and culture. Situated on a prominent hilltop position with a commanding view of the surrounding landscape, Ararat Lunatic Asylum was built to meet the increasing volume of mentally ill patients in the region. Opened its doors to its first patient in October of 1867. Now, the citizens of Ararat originally called this hill Cemetery Hill, and as it housed the local graveyard and the Ararat Gold. The idea was potential criminals in the town below would have a perpetual reminder of what awaited them if they were caught and might be deterred from committing a crime in the first place. While it would be tempting to think the hauntings in this area due to the fact they built this place on a burial ground situation, as in the Steven Spielberg movie Poltergeist. Truth is, the bodies were exhumed and moved to what's now the town cemetery prior to the asylum being built. As the Australian public's perception toward mental illness became more sympathetic over time, facilities such as Ararat changed their titles, while continuing to perform the same function of safeguarding and caring for the mentally ill. The facility that began life as Ararat Lunatic Asylum was required to change its name in 1905 when the Australian Lunacy Act mandated all asylums now referred to as hospitals for the insane. Just a few decades later, in 1933, the newly passed Mental Hygiene Act took umbrage at the word insane, along with all the negative connotations associated with that term. And so it made a law that such asylums and hospitals for the insane were now to be labeled mental hospitals. In turn, the name the Aradale Mental Hospital was settled on. Ararat's a sprawling complex of buildings when it was constructed. Town with care institution. Designer to name for the original asylum facility to be as close to self-sufficient and self-contained was reasonably possible, which is why Ararat possessed its own garden and fruit orchards and vineyards and a host of other sources of sustenance. Even had its own dedicated morgue, being something of a necessity for an institution that held more than 1,000 patients and half as many staff members to look after them. Records showed that at the height of its occupancy, the asylum was seeing an average of 5 deaths a week. The asylum housed mentally ill patients ranging in severity from relatively stable to the incurably insane. During the 19th century, it wasn't unheard of for some poor, unfortunate individual to be committed to an institution such as Ararat for a little more reason having a series of seizures or being born with developmental disorders such as Down syndrome. And we can say with certainty that some, if not many, of these patients committed here throughout the years did not actually need to be institutionalized at all, but ended up in confinement simply due to bad fortune and the fact that, frankly, nobody in the family wanted them. Indeed, the Ararat Lunatic Asylum was an extremely easy place to get into and almost impossible one to get out of once you were a patient. Leaving aside for a moment the tall and sturdy walls that enclose the facility, rendering it extremely difficult to escape from physically. Actually getting out there in a legitimate manner required a signature of less than 8 doctors and administrators. It only took 2 signatures to get in, 8 to get out. That tells us a great deal about the philosophy upon which that asylum was run. Once you were there, the likelihood was you'd stay there for a considerable amount of time. Well, special measures had to be taken to isolate and safeguard those violent criminal offenders who are also diagnosed with mental illness. So the old Aradale building was converted into what became known as J Ward. That's a cross between a jail and a mental ward, which we'd know today as a high-security institution for the criminally insane. In order to make the move from an ordinary prison to a cell on J Ward at Aradale, a prisoner had to be certified as criminally insane by just 2 doctors. In practice, it was sometimes all too easy to get somebody confined to J Ward. Let's talk about a man by the name of Bill Wallace, who passed away within the walls of J Ward at the grand old age of 170. He held the record as the longest-lived and longest incarcerated tenant. 1925, he was accused of being involved in a fight with another man over a cigarette, which supposedly ended in him killing the other man. Details of the case, of course, a little bit murky. But what we do know is that Wallace was detained at the pleasure of the governor, given neither a trial nor a conviction. But he was declared insane by 2 doctors, remanded to Aradale's J Ward, where he remained for the next 64 years. The record doesn't say if he got the cigarette or not. Well, by 1887, J Ward was up and running. He continued to house some of the most desperate and violent criminal patients for more than 100 years, until it was finally shut down in 1991. It's now a museum that draws crowds of curious tourists. The gaol was built to architecturally mimic London's famous Pentonville Prison, which is heralded as the British capital's first modern correctional institution. In fact, it's still in use today. Both the old gaol and the ward that it later became would see more than a few deaths within its walls, such as George Finnemont, fourth governor of the gaol, who collapsed and died of a massive heart attack in September 1886. That happened while he was climbing an old stone staircase. 2005, a local newspaper called the Aradale Advertiser published an article reporting that a visiting paranormal research team was fortunate enough to record the appearance of a mysterious mist climbing that very same staircase. That staircase, by the way, leads up to the old kitchens. And, of course, there were also executions, at least 3 hangings during the 1870s and 1880s before the gaol became J Ward, all of them as punishment for the crime of murder. Correspondent for Sydney's Evening News newspaper telegraphed an account of the hanging of convicted murderer Robert Francis Burns, September 25th, 1883. According to that account, Upjohn, the executioner, at once pinioned the prisoner's arms and put the cap on his head. Burns was then led out to the scaffold. He walked with a firm step and took his place on the scaffold. Upjohn appeared to be very nervous, and adjusting the rope permitted the noose to hang loosely with the knot close to Burns' chin. The hangman's attention was drawn to the bungle, and he merely pulled the noose more tight. Head warder Enkin stepped up, pulled the noose more tightly, and put the knot on the back of Burns' neck. Well, death was instantaneous, Burns' vertebrae being broken and a windpipe severed. The deceased left a written statement thanking the gaoler for his considerate treatment. Well, the bodies of all 3 convicted men were buried within the borders of the Aradale Lunatic Asylum complex, where they're still there to this day, interred in a standing position in unconsecrated ground, facing the old gaol walls in a superstitious belief their restless spirits will be prevented from leaving their final place of imprisonment. And if you visit J Ward today, you can still see the memorial plaques dedicated to the memory of those condemned men, mounted on the eastern wall of the exercise yard. Current Aradale lore holds that frost refused to form on the graves of those 3 dead men, which may say more about the local climate and location of the plaques than anything ghostly. The quality of medical and psychiatric care delivered there was, by the standards in modern-day medicine, best described as rudimentary and ineffective, and in some cases verged on the downright barbaric. Living conditions were poor, some patients spending the entirety of their day naked within the confines of their room or cell, forced by necessity to leave themselves on the floor. Food ranged from the bland and the poor in quality to utterly terrible. Experimental treatments such as electroconvulsive or shock therapy and brain lobotomies would also have been the norm for some of the less controllable patients. The Aradale Mental Hospital continued to care for patients until 1993. J Ward closed in 1991, and some female patients still housed there until 2001 when Aradale ceased to operate as a healthcare facility. Parts of the complex, such as J Ward, were kept open to serve as a museum, and stories of life within the walls of Ararat began to be told by volunteers and tour guides, the ghost stories never far behind. Tour guides began to share, compare, and collect their stories, and it soon became apparent that far more was going on inside the old insane asylum than first met the eye. One such story concerns a carved brick, which was kept on display upstairs in a specific spot inside the recreation room. This particular brick was hurled most of the way across the empty rec room one day, causing an almighty crash to be heard when it landed on the floor. An increasing number of visitors reported the sensation of being touched and poked or prodded when nobody else was within touching distance. Sounds of disembodied cries and footsteps and voices became commonplace, as did sightings of dark shadow people, and in contrast, the ghosts of the guards and nurses who watched over the former occupants came to be relatively common. On a calm September night in 2007, investigators from the Melbourne-based paranormal research group Ghost Research International conducted their own investigation of the defunct Ararat Lunatic Asylum. In a complex the size of Aradale, whose sprawling layout means the buildings are scattered over a wide area, some tough choices have to be made regarding the best place to concentrate both investigators and recording equipment. According to Darren, the point man on this particular investigation, I think the biggest challenge of any investigation, but especially at Aradale, is trying to have the access, equipment, and protocols in place to create an environment in which any event can be further documented from multiple sources. Based on its long and colorful history, the Ghost Research International team wisely chose to concentrate the majority of their time, attention, and resources on J Ward. Once the old Ararat goal, cameras were situated to cover the stairs and entrance to the old kitchen down on the basement level, the main cell block in the west wing on the ground floor, and the main cell block itself up above on the second floor. May 25th, 1872, gold prisoner Thomas Wall successfully hung himself in his cell on the second floor. The Ghost Research International investigators used this piece of historical fact to their advantage, putting a digital voice recorder in that same cell and leaving it running in the hopes of maybe recording his voice from beyond the grave. DVR is left running for just short of 4.5 hours. The audio file was played back and almost entirely unremarkable, except for one 30-second period during which the whistling noise is heard fading in and out. Source of this whistling noise couldn't be satisfactorily explained. Could be the melancholy whistling of a former occupant of the cell block. It's tempting to attribute this whistling to one of the investigators or their guide, but all were present and accounted for at the time. They appear on the feeds from the other three cameras, so no human agency was responsible for that whistling. Darren found this to be one of the most impressive pieces of evidence gathered during his investigation of the Ararat Mental Hospital. Referring to the whistling recorded at 10:59 p.m., the source of which couldn't be ascertained, he went on to say that the DVR cameras at that time documented there was nobody in the area. Although when taken on its own, the event was labeled as inconclusive, it was considered worthy enough to warrant further examination of the area and any further investigation. Ghost Research International sets a high bar for what constitutes possible evidence of the paranormal. Their post-investigation report throws out a number of light anomalies and orbs on the grounds that can't be accounted as evidence due to the likelihood of them being easily explained away by dust particles and insects and other simple causes. One incident that appeared promising at first glance took place at the bottom of the kitchen steps in almost the exact same spot that Governor Fiddlemont died of a heart attack. Sudden flash of light inexplicably illuminated the lower part of the staircase and was successfully recorded on a remote camera covering the basement. Although some initial excitement concerning the lot anomaly, the Ghost Research International investigator who discussed the incident was quick to downplay it. He said there was a lack of corroborative evidence, with only the data being from a single frame of digital footage from the DVR. The nearby PIR showed no abnormality. Again, the balance of probabilities would state the cause was of natural origin. Although rated as inconclusive on initial evaluation, after a more recent look, it's probably natural cause is highly likely, given it does appear consistent with a digital artifact, knowing the camera concerned was a remote control motorized type. In other words, it wasn't considered to be a ghost. Even though the EMF meter readings remained normal, observers in the area had gone to report unusual smells as the night went on, one of which was the odor of soap reported in the vicinity of the old bathhouse, and a feeling of such intense cold that it induced shivering in one of the team members, around whom temperature fluctuations were successfully recorded. Shortly after 3 a.m., the investigators decided to conduct an exercise in provocation, what is also referred to as enticement. A pendulum was used to attempt to gain answers to questions the investigators would ask. And several times the pendulum did swing in apparent response to the questions. When one questioner requested any spirits present trying to make a noise, they were rewarded with a tapping sound that was not only heard by the investigative team, but also successfully recorded on no less than 3 separate occasions. But maybe the most sinister occurrence of the evening took place at the conclusion of a vigil, when all the investigators had left the building for a break, with the exception of one solitary researcher who volunteered to remain behind in a room that was close to the main control center. Very few people would be willing to spend even a couple of minutes alone in a haunted old building, with the history of a place like Aradale, but she most certainly did not lack for courage. She also had good reason to feel secure. She knew she had lots of eyes watching out for her safety. Well, for those who are unfamiliar with the control center of a modern paranormal investigation, imagine a scaled-down version of a mission control for a space launch. Banks of monitor screens display the video feeds from multiple live cameras, streaming on both the visible light spectrum and the infrared or the thermal. In the case of GRI set up, 6 infrared cameras and 2 thermal cameras were set up to cover all the areas surrounding the control center. Even something as tiny as a passing mouse ought to be picked up by one of the cameras if it strayed into the area. Well, with the majority of the team exiting the building, all was quiet and peaceful. And then her eyes were drawn by movement. She looked up, and the closed door to the room was ever so slowly opening. She knew it had to be one of her colleagues who probably had forgotten something and returned to pick it up. But looking downward into the gap between the bottom of the door and the concrete floor, investigators see one long uninterrupted glow of light shining underneath it. No shadows, no indications of feet. Nobody was standing there. Well, the door continued to open and slam violently backward on its hinges. The room outside was completely empty. Getting her a 2-way radio, the investigator put out a call for the rest of the team, and the cavalry came quickly, converging on her location from outside. They didn't encounter anybody along the way in and began the search. The building was empty. You could review the footage from the array of 8 cameras. Ghost Research investigators started to play back the video files on the DVR. And there were no cameras directly covering the door itself, although the surrounding rooms and corridors are heavily blanketed with coverage. So was somebody, maybe a living prankster, sneaking around? Maybe there was a wild animal on the loose. Aradale sees more than its fair share of possum activity. But if that's the case, then their form would have been captured on video. But nothing was captured, other than utter emptiness and silence. How about a sudden draft or a breeze? That could have opened the door. The windows were closed. It was a relatively still and calm night. The Ghost Research International investigators enthusiastically threw themselves into trying to replicate the phenomena using their body weight to throw the door forcefully open. Well, they were never able to accurately replicate the air-splitting crash witnessed by the startled female investigator. The lead investigator later learned that this room had been the scene of many unusual experiences in the past when other groups had come in to investigate the building. Episodes of unexplainable nausea, sometimes accompanied by severe panic attacks, were the norm in that room. When the exhausted team members picked up their kit and headed home just after daybreak, they had nearly 24 hours of video and audio data to review, not to mention more than 1,100 photographs to wade through in search of anomalies. But surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, their story didn't quite end there. According to the GRI, that's Ghost Research International report, one of the team president, Jay Ward, reported an event they had had a few days afterwards. Lying in bed, they felt hands grabbing them. Upon trying to stop the hands, there was nothing actually there to stop. The intensity of the touching only increased. It was a perception this was an ex-prisoner, Jay Ward. In a panic state, they began to wonder if this was a dream, even though they now found themselves in the same situation they dreamt, that of being in their own bed. Uneasiness continued for a few days afterwards, with persistent thoughts of how real this dream seemed. Although a totally subjective experience, you have to wonder that this paranormal investigator is truly dreaming, or there's some remnant of a former inmate or prisoner had followed him home uninvited from the Aradale Mental Hospital. Well, according to the team leader, I personally would consider the most likely explanation of the event to be of a natural origin, a natural reaction of the mind to unnatural stimuli, as referenced in the report, he said. Likewise, I wouldn't call it a dream either. It may have been the mind's reaction to having thoughts of a recent Aradale visit while being in a state between sleep and being awake. Although the Aradale campus has long had a reputation in the local area for being haunted, it gained far wider media attention when it was one of the featured investigative sites for the TV show Haunting Australia, which a team of paranormal enthusiasts, investigators, and exorcists tried to uncover the mysterious contained within the walls of the old asylum. And the night chosen by the production crew for investigation just so happened to be the night of a full moon. During the course of the show, Melbourne-based paranormal investigator William Tabone recounts his own terrifying experiences on the confines of the old asylum. He was scratched on the back of his head by an invisible assailant and left 2 long, straight abrasions that actually drew blood. Tech crew branch of the Haunting Australia team produced a diverse array of devices and technologies to their investigation at Aradale. One of these included a Tesla coil used to generate high-voltage electrical fields that some researchers believe may assist spirits in manifesting in the material world. Now, use of a Tesla coil, of course, is controversial and divisive among the paranormal research community. For example, the TV show Ghost Mine also went on to employ a Tesla coil, after which one of the hosts of the show believes she saw a dark black mass moving across the room. On the other hand, during a 7-hour Ghost Adventures live broadcast from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum on the night before Halloween of 2009, guest investigator attempted to use a Tesla coil contained within a mobile plexiglass cage to trap and contain a ghost. What instantly became the show's most controversial moment, the broadcast feed of this particular investigator supposedly getting a EMF meter yanked out of his hand by what he later claimed to be a poltergeist, looked suspiciously like he'd simply thrown the EMF meter himself. So would the Tesla coil stir up a storm of ghostly activity for the Haunting Australia team? Well, these ghost hunters who've conducted investigations at Aradale regard the men's wing as being one of the most active areas, maybe because it was used to house some of the most mentally disturbed individuals in the entire institution. In the light of all this, it made good sense to send one of the Haunting Australia psychics into that particular part of the building, which had to be entered through a walkway that was nicknamed the Suicide Bridge. The second floor was the scene of a number of inmate suicides over the years. Sensing and hearing a large crowd of people on the opposite side of the entrance door, psychic Raylene Cable was hindered by the sensation of a male presence lurking behind her, tugging her back every time she got close to that door. She sensed that this spirit was pacing up and down the corridor in front of her and wanted to bar her from accessing the men's wing. Whoever this male spirit was, he was ultimately successful, causing Raylene to turn around and leave before she ever got inside the second floor. Not to be put off, a male psychic was sent to take her place. Former bare-knuckle boxer and psychic Ian Lawman seemed to be overcome with a nauseating stench when he entered the men's wing. Footage recorded on his mounted camera and used in that particular episode shows him struggling not to throw up, also having a hard time drawing breath. Tour guides at Aradale tell similar stories of visitors and staff alike who suddenly felt extremely sick for no apparent reason while touring the complex. Some of them have even fainted, regaining consciousness a few seconds later, completely puzzled as to what had caused the incident. Lawman also got the shock of his life when the apparition of a female with electric blue eyes appeared in the diagonal viewing slit cut into one of the cell doors. Unnerved and startled, he took to his heels and fled the area. According to what Lawman later had to say, she was a psychopath that wanted to hurt him. Was it to be his own encounter with this vengeful female ghost? Returned to the same location with a second paranormal investigator in tow, the two men recorded the sound of a gasp or loud exhalation of breath from an unseen source. Going back downstairs, the apparition appeared to Lawman a second time, lurking behind the viewing slit of another cellway door. Tour guides reported multiple ghost sightings concerning a female patient who apparently takes a delight in jumping out in front of visitors and scaring them half to death. Just thought this might be the same spirit that ambushed Ian Lawman. The eyewitness testimony of psychics can be fascinating, but doesn't constitute evidence unless it can be backed up by other more tangible sources. Disembodied gas captured on the second floor is a good example of an objective supporting evidence. But more impressive is that what investigator Gaurav Tirare captured on his full-spectrum camera in one of the deserted corridors. Sandwiched between two empty and unremarkable photographs, the middle frame shows the distinctly humanoid form of a tall, black, shadow figure. Seems to be staring ominously right back at the photographer. This figure is wearing a skirt or a frock coat of some kind, judging from the way its silhouette is composed. As evidence goes, this photograph is equally chilling and compelling. Haunting Australia team debates whether Gaurav may have captured the apparition of Nurse Carey, the most frequently reported ghost at Aradale. Numerous visitors and investigators have encountered her restless spirit prowling the corridor dressed in pristine nurse's uniform. But unlike the sinister female spirit encountered by Ian Lawman earlier, Nurse Carey's motives are far more benign. Her presence more comforting and soothing as befits a member of the world's oldest healing profession. Well, this particular episode of Haunting Australia is posted online and on YouTube, and you might check it out and make up your own mind. For writer Marty Young, the first weekend of October 2014 was set aside for his day planner for a creative retreat. That's an opportunity to explore the myths and legends surrounding the infamous Aradale Mental Hospital, guided and accompanied by a number of experts in the field of Australian paranormal research. Marty's specialist genre is that of horror and the macabre, and his fiction has been nominated for the prestigious Bram Stoker Award. As founding president of the Australian Horror Writers Association, who better to unlock the mysteries of this haunted facility? In his write-up of what would turn out to be a very eventful weekend indeed, he described the everyday conditions endured by Aradale inmates, according to one of the tour guides. Some of the things that happened at Aradale in the past are truly horrific. An asylum was supposed to have been a place of comfort, but not even 100 years ago, our knowledge of mental health was in its infancy. We knew nothing, and unfortunately, it was only because of what happened in places like Aradale that we have knowledge we do now. And even still, the list of atrocities goes on, leaving incontinent, severely retarded patients naked in their cells, where they'd defecate wherever they wanted, only for them and their cells to be hosed down at the end of each day. Surgical operations and human experimentation performed at anesthetic, while the next patient can hear it as they wait in a small cell connected to the operating room, and worse, watch it all through the peephole in the door. There were rapes, an abortion chair that got regular use, day pens in which the patients were thrown every day regardless of weather, where they'd die of hypothermia or heat stroke, a morgue that wasn't fit for a pig with heads left outside in the sun so the skin would dry and peel away, limbs tied to the branches of a tree in order to drain, lobotomy performed to cure patients of any and all afflictions. The youngest lobotomized patient turned out to be a 12-year-old boy. Aradale tour guides had no shortage of spooky stories with which to chill their visiting guests. One such instance took place one evening when the guide was locking up cell doors prior to closing up the women's ward for the night. Suddenly appearing as if out of nowhere came the sound of running feet pounding along the floor of the corridor in which the incredulous tour guide stood. Footsteps were coming straight for him. Well, this particular corridor happened to be divided by a sturdy door. Footsteps ceased abruptly, only to be instantly replaced by the sounds of violent hammering on the opposite side of that very same door. Could this be the residual noises of a long-dead inmate battering with fists and feet in a desperate attempt to break her way out to freedom? Well, whatever it was, the tour guide told Marty and his group it was hitting the door with such brutal force it was making the walls shake. And displaying considerably greater bravery than most people would in such a situation, guard opened the door and peeked around it. The corridor was completely and utterly empty. A friend of Marty's visited Aradale and showed him a photograph he'd taken of one of the windows while he was there. And it doesn't appear to be a remarkable photo at first, till one who looks closer notices that a face seems to be peering out behind the glass. That stairwell happened to be blocked off, completely inaccessible these days, but the face was quite distinctly there. Well, on that day, we come to the end of today's show. Run out of time. We'll be back tomorrow, and once again, we'll be talking about ghosts and haunted locations and all kinds of weirdness. Until then, this is Ken Hudnall for the Ken Hudnall Show saying have a truly great evening.